first question is from Rosie Ball. And Rosie has asked, do you think that self-control or the ability to defer gratification is largely genetic? Even though people can improve self-control through specific techniques, are some of us innately more able to do so than others? Rosie, I think that's a really tricky question because when we say largely genetic, virtually everything is genetic to some degree or other. And it's really difficult to know what is left over after that. Now, given the fact that we have early experiences, it's really difficult to tease apart the genetics from those early experiences. So by the time we're able to do any studies on people, trying to work out whether it's genetic or not is really difficult. And I think that if it was genetic, then what you would see is that the children of any person with an addiction would also have that same issue. And it's not as straightforward as that. So I think it's going to have some form of genetic contribution, but I don't know. I don't think it's easy to say. So I'm afraid it's a bit of a non-answer because it's really difficult to say. Because by the time we can test people, young children, they've already had a lot of experiences. So how can we tease apart their genetics from their experiences? Right, I have put up the survey, so I hope that you can see at least my name. If you can't see Kim's name, you can hopefully see my name and the survey will be on there. So I hope that has worked. Right, so the next question is from, super fan Jane Croucher. Oh, Jane, why did you have to ask me a difficult question? So Jane asks, why is skin picking so addictive? It's a terrible problem that she's had since she was 11. And she says, when logically there's no positive side to it at all, it looks awful, hurt, etc. You know, I hate to say this, but until I started doing this talk, I didn't even know it existed. I don't know. I think that there must be what the explanation would be, and this is me completely trying to develop an explanation, is that there must be something that initially you were getting out of it, even if it was a distraction from something else. You must have been getting something from it, and that has turned into a behavior. So although it in itself isn't giving you pleasure, you must have got something out of those first few times, and that somehow got linked in with the behavior becoming initially pleasurable, but then over time became difficult to control. That's the only thing I can think, because I think there are people who started doing something which they thought was enjoyable, and then eventually it started irritating them, but at that point they'd actually lost the control. And I think that this would be the case with people who've got hard substance use problems, that they got pleasure out of it initially, but now they don't. So I'm thinking that when it first started up, there must have been something that you were getting out of it that created that cycle, but I'm only speculating there. Okay, so the next question is from Max Bowman, and Max asks, do specific drugs have specific things that they're partnered with, so in terms of comorbidity? That's a good question, Max. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer. The reason for that is that some of this is going to be at the biological level, because if you remember, I said that reward area, the VTA, this area, that responds to all those feel-good thingies. Now, there's different types of what are called receptors which are where our neurons, which are the individual nerve cells, they meet, and they have this junction called a synapse. And at that synapse, it's like a relay where this guy runs in and he passes a message to this next guy, who then runs along with his message and gives it to the next person along. And that's how information is passed from one area of the brain to the other. Now, at that junction where they pass the relay thing, that's where different drugs have their impact. And they have them through these things called receptors, where cocaine will do something, heroin will do something else, alcohol something, nicotine something, caffeine something, etc. And each of them works in slightly different ways. And this is about the biology of the substance itself and the biology of these receptors, which are basically the thing that grabs the relay baton. And so there will be some drugs that have comorbidities. But I think that that very first table that I showed would be saying is that ultimately it's not about the biology that's important, it's about the loss of control, which is why you can end up with a comorbidity between a behavioral addiction, such as gambling, and a substance use. Because with the behavioral one, there isn't that biological interface. So I think there's a complex thing going on there, that some comorbidity will be because of the biology, but some of it is just because of that loss of control. And how and why is a really difficult thing to work out. And this is why more research is needed. And ultimately, what I would say is that this would be the reason why we can't yet develop effective rehabilitation programs, because if we understood those things about the comorbidities and whether it's at the biological level or the psychological level, etc., then we'd be able to answer those, we'd be able to treat someone. If it was a simple thing of giving someone a drug to stop that biological thing, then they'd have developed the drugs. But it's obviously not as straightforward as that. If it was just a simple biological thing, we'd have done it. If it's a simple psychological thing, then psychological therapy would work as well. But neither of these approaches is working fully. So what that suggests to me is that the explanation of addiction needs to be much more nuanced and multifactorial, to take lots of different things into consideration, and possibly also seeing the fact that you've got these interactions between different substances going on. So I think that the comorbidities are probably at the surface demonstrating how complex the condition itself is, which is why treatment is difficult and relapse rates are so high. Okay. So Olivia Darville, who I think is one of my students, she's asked, I'm guessing it's to do with how grooming is satisfying or getting rid of dirt or parasites, or this being overly done. I think you're right, Olivia, that there must have been something pleasurable. I think Olivia is referring to Jane's earlier question about the skin picking, that there must be something pleasurable about that initial activity. And when I pinch myself, there is a bit of a pleasurable thing. It's only a tiny little bit, a tiny little can grow. So I think that there is something to do with that grooming behavior. Must have some biological basis in terms of pleasure, and maybe that's where that comes from. But it is a speculation. Jill Salmon has asked, is there evidence that those with a TBI affecting the pre-cortex are more likely to become addicts? That's a really, really good question, Jill. I don't know the answer, but I think that I wouldn't be surprised if there was, because if you've got that loss of control, then you do have that problem. I know, for example, and I don't know if my wonderful friend Andrew James is watching this, but there are issues to do with sexually inappropriate behavior that happens after traumatic brain injury, and part of that is to do with loss of control. So I think that your question is really interesting, and I think I'm going to get my team to write it down and for us to find an answer. And maybe if you write to me, I can find you an answer for it, because it sounds like a very plausible thing. I know, for example, and now the brain cells are beginning to work. So there's a famous case of a guy working on the railroads in Vermont in the 18 something or others, that's 1860, where they were needing to blast holes through rock faces to lay down the railway tracks. So they had to have these timed explosions, but there was an explosion that went off before it should have done, and an iron bar about that thick, an inch thick, flew up, went through this guy's face, went through lower left cheek, and exited from the middle of his head. So it went like this. I won't stab myself. Then it came out the middle of his head and flew. Now, it was going so fast when it went through his face that it flew a further 20 feet in the air before landing. Now, unsurprisingly, this man, who's called Phineas Gage, fell over. But more surprisingly, he didn't die. He was taken to hospital, he was patched up. And then afterwards, after he'd been patched up, he seemed okay, even though an iron bar that thick had gone through his face and obviously destroyed part of his brain. So initially, people thought, is the front of the brain like the appendix, where it's not really doing anything? We don't need it. Because he could still talk, walk, remember, recognize, count, etc. But after a little bit of time, it became apparent that although these, what we call primary cognitive abilities, were intact, the man's higher level abilities, which are these executive functions, had been severely compromised. Initially, it was described as a change in personality, but in fact, it was a change in behavior. So this man, Phineas Gage, he went from being a very reliable, church-going person, pillar of society, etc., and he was a foreman in this company. He lost his job, became really unreliable, became socially uncouth, urinating in public, swearing in public, etc. Lost his money, became bankrupt. 150 years later, a patient was seen in Iowa by Paul Eslinger and Antonio Damasio. And this patient had a tumor growing in the front of his brain. And they tried all the therapies they could, radiotherapy, drugs, etc., to try to kill the tumor. And unfortunately, those didn't work. And so eventually they had to do the final thing, which is surgery, because they don't do surgery unless they really have to. So they did surgery to remove the tumor, and the way that surgery with anything here works is that you have to drill a hole in the top of the brain and then come down, because you can't go this way. So they had to come down, scoop the tumor out, and they saved his life. Now, within 2 years of this man who, like Phineas Gage, had a good job, the man now had been the finance controller for a company. He started making lots of bad judgments, lost his job, lost all his money, became bankrupt, just like Phineas Gage, divorced, married again, and divorced again, all within 2 years of surgery. Now, that sounds like bad luck and maybe a coincidence, but it all happened after the surgery. He became incapable of making a decision. There's a description of him taking 5 hours to decide where to go for dinner. And this is a man who used to control the finances for a company. Now, I was fortunate enough to do my postdoctoral fellowship with Antonio Damasio, and so I lived in the States for a couple of years, and I was lucky enough to work with this really quite remarkable patient. And talking to him, you would not know that there was anything wrong with him whatsoever. He's incredibly articulate. He's got an IQ of 135. And unfortunately, he passes the main tests of executive functions. And part of the problem with that is that it demonstrates that the test that we have at the moment for that that behavior, the executive functions aren't good enough. And so to me, what we have there is an example of someone who whose behavior, his cognitive behavior and ability to make decisions and etc. has been severely compromised because of brain injury. And therefore, it wouldn't surprise me, and we see this a lot with patients who have damage in the front of the brain, that their ability to make these decisions becomes compromised, and a lot of them do lose their money. So I think that your question about the substance use is really interesting, because that link has been broken. So it would be interesting to check this out. So I will look it up. So do email me, and we can converse about this. Okay, what we got next? Right, so Faye Andrews has asked, is it possible that addiction is one of many behaviors of a mental health condition in its early stages, or addiction causes the later mental health issues? I would find it very difficult to believe that addiction is the beginning of a mental health condition. I think that there are things where there are commonalities, and I think that addiction could manifest later with mental health difficulties. But I think that there's this complex vortex that's happening where the mental health difficulties are probably brought on by the addiction, but the addiction might have been brought on by early trauma. So we heard the example from the charity of someone. He said that there was that trauma early on in life, and eventually alcohol became a way to cope with that. And then the thing that people are seeing is the addiction to alcohol, but there's the trauma that's left being unaddressed. But then eventually, if this person develops a lot of mental health difficulties, then the mental health difficulties aren't actually because of the addiction. They were precipitated by traumatic experiences. So that's why I would say certainly that I don't think that that an addiction is the start of a mental health problem, because you have many people who do successfully walk that journey through recovery successfully and are completely okay. And that's why I think that addiction therefore leads to mental health problems. I would really strongly disagree with. I mean, I haven't done the research, but from my understanding of it, it wouldn't be. It doesn't seem plausible. Mental health problems following addiction, that to me seems plausible, but I think that that's probably a consequence of the difficulties that have been thrown at this person because of the addiction, which may have started because of the difficulties earlier on in life. So I think that that's the way I would say it. I stand to be corrected, and if you have a stance on that, then I'd be very interested to hear that. But thank you for your question. Rosie has asked another question, and Rosie has said, can you see deep brain stimulation or something comparable being used to treat addiction? Presumably you feel that would be a backward step. That's an interesting question, Rosie. So Rosie's talking about deep brain stimulation. So do you remember the little rat in the cage who was getting his for pressing the lever? So Rosie's talking about deep brain stimulation, which is a technique that is being worked on for different things. And for Parkinson's, for example, deep brain stimulation is being used for helping people improve movement and things like that. So it's effectively waking up an area of the brain that might have got a bit sleepy. So Rosie's asking whether deep brain stimulation could help here. Now, the difficulty there, Rosie, is that what that presupposes is that we know where addiction is. With Parkinson's, it is known which areas of the brain it emanates from, and therefore waking those areas up by stimulating them is a good way to go about things. So if you've got a localized issue and that area has gone to sleep and you can to kind of wake it up, then that's great. But with the addiction, we've got the biological stuff going on, but we've got the psychological stuff which might have precipitated the biological stuff, because this thing isn't going to that's not going to control me. There's something else that's happening with some people, as we saw the people from the army or working in the sales or whatever, in the drinking culture, etc. That psychological process is the thing that might make the drinking too much and then falling below that gray line and then going into that space where alcohol is only to cover the negative feelings. Now, so what we have there is a psychological thing, the behavior pattern around, work environments or whatever, which then results in this behavioral thing of drinking a lot to keep up with everyone, which then which then results in this biological changing within the system. And then eventually, when that person is in a particular place where their biology has finally taken them, at that point, addiction is set in. But then it's not in one localized place. And I think that's the complexity for something like DBS, because that would require one discrete area of the brain, knowing that that area is the one that is causing the behavior, and saying, okay, let's go in there and fix that. And with something like Parkinson's, that can work. But I think the complexity with addiction is that there isn't an addiction center. Just like with depression, depression is so complicated that if we knew what caused depression, then we could just go in there and do some stimulation and it'd be fine. But depression is way, 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 way more complex than that. And that's why the treatment efficacy of different types of drug therapies or behavioral therapies is okay, but not great. And I think what we've got here is a parallel, that addiction is not just this biological dependence on a substance, it's way more than that. And I think that's what we need to understand. What is it that took someone to that point? We can understand the biological processes a bit, but there's a lot more going on than that, I think. Okay. Jill Salmon, thanks to my new assistant, who's only just started this week, Oramir Esheto, who's in Utah, in the States. She's posted a paper in the chat which indicates that there is a link between early life TBI, traumatic brain injury, and addiction vulnerability. So thank you very much, Oramir. You're already off to a flying start. So it does seem that certainly early life TBI, so maybe during adolescence, that can cause problems. Now, this is rather interesting about the paper that Oramir has found, because this takes me back to the study in Dunedin, the longitudinal study in New Zealand, that the impact on that fragile adolescent brain. If that adolescent brain hasn't developed its control, then that's where you can get the addictions and the problems with the cognitive functions, etc. And it seems from the paper that Oramir has posted that early life TBI, so in childhood or adolescence, doesn't allow that control center to develop strongly enough, and therefore there is a vulnerability there. And I know that in other work that we're doing, lovely student of mine, Katerina Rosa, is doing, and which is started by I think Pietro Manzello, who's watching, and Jeremy Mason. We're looking at the impact of early childhood head injuries on later criminality. And the issue here is that a child's brain is still forming, as I showed. It's not fully formed until the mid-20s. And so you've got this developing system, and if that is damaged through head knocks, either a lot of small ones or one big event, you're damaging a system that hasn't fully formed yet. And the work that we're doing with ex-offenders is looking at the fact that when you, I just need to go and turn the oven off. I will be back in a moment. Sorry about that. Usually it's quite difficult to cook fully after one of my talks because of when it ends. So I try to multitask or get planning, and I set the oven on before, and it was telling me that it's done its stuff. Right, so the work that we're doing, that Katerina's doing, that Pietro and Jeremy were doing with me before, is about the fact that if you go into a prison and ask people there if they've ever had a head injury, what you will find is that the rate of head injuries in a prison is 8 times what you find on your high street. So there's a huge amount of head injuries in a prison population. Now you could say, oh, these are bad people. They're in prison. Of course they're going to have head injuries. And they've got into trouble. That's why they've got head injuries. But in fact, when you ask them when they had their first head injury, most of them had their first head injury as children and before their first crime. And there's a really, really, really strong pattern there that head injuries early on in life can predispose, it's not a one-to-one thing, but predispose someone to later criminality. And so what we're doing is trying to look at that. And the story I want to tell is that someone who is in prison who's had a head injury is actually someone with an undiagnosed brain injury. And unless we treat the cause of their behavior, which is the head injury, which is making it difficult for them to control their behavior, then you're going to get this continual cycle called recidivism, where they come out of prison, society thinks that they're rehabilitated, but in fact, the root cause of the problem is still there, which is the problem in that control center. And so what we're trying to do is to understand that, to try to develop rehabilitation, which isn't about necessarily saying, you stay in prison for 5 years. While they're in prison, actually help them with some of these executive functions that may then help them for avoiding similar situations in the future. And we're seeing now also that with continual head injuries through contact sports, there's a higher risk of dementia. In the States, there was a big case where the players' union sued the NFL because you've got men in their mid to late 30s retiring, but a few years later developing dementia. In their 40s, they've got dementia. In the UK, we've got the same problem where a lot of the guys who used to play with the quite heavy footballs and who were heading the ball, a lot of them have ended up with dementia. And apparently the 1966 World Cup football winning team, most of those guys have ended up with dementia. And recently, I think it's the Welsh rugby captain, 41 years old, has been diagnosed with dementia, and this is because of repeated small knocks on the head. So what we've got there is a commonality, early traumatic brain injury, or early trauma even. And in fact, Kim, my student who's taking the questions on the chat, she's doing this remarkable study looking at children who are looked after, so children who started life in foster care, etc., they may have missed out on really important attachment processes, which we get from our mothers, like my darling mother here, and which are really important for these control processes in the brain. It's a complex story, but from the research that Kim has done, apparently, I think a third of children who started off in foster care end up in prison. Now, they don't even have the brain injury, but it seems that, again, you've got this executive control thing again. So what we see here is actually parallel things going on, that the loss of control because of the breakage or the weakening of the link between the reward centers and the control centers through substance use or misuse, the head injuries during childhood, one big one resulting in criminality, possibly. And we've also now got small repeated head injuries could lead to dementia. And we've got, without even head injuries or substance use, we've got a problem with that early attachment, which could affect those processes, these executive control processes, which then predispose a young person from that background who was fostered, etc., predispose them to difficulties which could end up in prison. What is the commonality? Again, the commonality is that control center in the front. So I think that there's a very complex thing going on here. And again, that demonstrates the fragility of a child's brain, both from a physical perspective, head injuries, or the effects of substances, alcohol, drugs, etc., or unfortunately even the psychological processes of warmth and attachment and things like that, and how any damage to those can result in quite negative consequences. Okay. Right, I don't think we've got any more questions. I'm going to wait for a couple more minutes, because this is it. It's sayonara after this. I don't know how many of you are still there. I hope that some of you are still there. It'd be nice to get a couple more questions, but we don't. Rosie said that DBS for depression is mentioned on the NHS website, which is why she wondered about it for addiction. Yes, yes, Rosie, I know that different types of stimulation are used. Because I'm not a clinician, I don't know about it, and that's why I didn't want to comment. But I think that what I know about electroconvulsive stimulation, for example, that was used for depression, it's only in very severe cases, Okay, so how much of a countdown? I'll have a couple more minutes while I enjoy the wine and look at that picture of my mummy and see if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I hope that people have been able to do the survey. We really appreciate your feedback, and my team and I, especially Vitote, we're developing an idea of how we're going to move forward. It's probably not going to be live talks again, and we will still be doing things, but it'll just be in a different way. Paul has completed the survey. Thank you very much, Paul. I'm glad that we managed to get the survey out to everyone, and tell all your friends to do the survey as well, Paul. Okay, so, oh, wow. Josh Thayer, wonderful Josh from San Francisco. Josh was my first ever Airbnb landlord over in San Francisco, February 2014. Only just heard about Airbnb. Josh was my first ever landlord that I stayed with, and we hit it off like anything, and 7 years later we're still friends, even though we only met for a couple of days all those years ago. So lovely to hear from Josh. And Josh has asked, are people who demonstrate one addiction more prone to suffering multiple addictions? I think they are, Josh. I don't know for certain, but I think the thing about the comorbidities demonstrates that once you have one, it is possible. And one of the things, from my understanding, is that often people who try to give up one thing end up moving to something else. So they might give up smoking, but then they end up with doing something else instead. And what that suggests is that there's something there in terms of a repetitive, pleasurable activity, or maybe avoiding something, I'm not sure. But it's very much the case that people tend to either move between addictions or have two at the same time. And therefore, what that suggests is that it's not the biological thing that the substance itself is giving them. There's something a bit more deep-rooted. So I think that if someone has one addiction, they're more likely to have something else. But as with a lot of these things, it's not a guarantee. So there will be people who don't. They just have that one thing and that's it. But if you look at it from the perspective of loss of control, or a weak control over your behavior, then that can manifest in a number of different realms. It might be more for one realm, such as alcohol, but then it might demonstrate itself in other realms as well. So that's what I would suggest. I think we're almost done. I'm just going to check with the team whether there's any more questions, but I think that might have been the last one. Rather nice that is from you, Josh. And maybe one day I'll see you again. 7 years ago. Now I can relax. Oh, there is one more. Well, I think I'll have another glass then. Okay, so Avril, a wonderful person in Dublin, has asked, is this why so many in recovery seem to become addicted to running, swimming, exercise, etc.? So Avril is taking the baton from Josh, and she's saying, is that why people in recovery become addicted to something else? Because they have a propensity to go for something and really do it. And I think that is the case where I don't know whether it's that's a loss of control, but I think it's about regaining control, but then really going for it. I have heard this, that people who've given something up, they really go for something else. And I suppose in cases like where they take up something like exercise, there is that endorphin rush that comes from these activities, from exercise, and maybe different types of addiction is developing, but at least it's a healthy one, as long as you don't do it too much, because all that too much running is not good on the knees. Not good on the knees. I don't know if too much swimming is bad on anything. It's probably really good for your body. So that addiction probably isn't bad. Maybe the chlorine isn't great for the skin, but that's something else, isn't it? Right, I'm just talking while I work, while my control center, my executive functions, who today my executive functions are called Kim and Priyanka. I'm waiting to see whether my executive functions, no, my executive functions have told me that that's it for questions. We're done. Well, it's been emotional. A year, 22 talks,